Welcome everyone to another episode of the complete Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier list. This tier list is covering an insane more than 400 different decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! It covers everything from sporadic garbage that Konami spat out, to the current TCG metagame. To order these decks, I've created a few key rules. First, this is for the TCG side of the game, not the OCG or Master Duel formats of Yu-Gi-Oh! I have to pick a format to get a unified ban list and card pool, so this does mean it's for the modern day format. Second, in order to easily categorize what is a deck, I've broken it down mostly in the archetypes, with plenty of slots for unique strategies like Rock Stun, Nurse Burn, or Chain Burn. This makes it mostly easy to recognize what each deck is from a glance on the tier list. The archetype system also means that decks are ranked as their strongest version or variant, while still using that archetype or strategy at its core. For example, Lightsworns could be counted as a Shizu Tier Limit Lightsworns, as it's the strongest build of Lightsworns, but a Shizu Tier Limit will be ranked with Horus higher on the list, since they're better with that build than they would be with Lightsworns. For the tiers themselves, there are 11 tiers spread out between 10 and 0. A ranking of 10 is game warping, completely impossible for anything else to do well, or traditionally what would be called a tier 0 format. A ranking of 0 means it's literally not a functional deck. Like, this is just a collection of cards Konami printed as pack filler, or never finished. The 3 to 5 range is roughly casual, and the 6 to 9 range is roughly where the competitive game takes place. This video covers the first half of Tier 4. Tier 4 is where we start to have really solid decks. These decks have solid end goals, and consistent enough engines. Overall, they're just very solid. These decks can usually play through 1 disruption consistently, and can make inboards with 1 to 2 disruptions. What keeps these decks from being higher is usually the overly fair nature of their disruptions, issues with blowout cards like D-Shifter, Nibiru, and Draw Lockbird, or maybe the decks just don't have a solid niche. These decks largely lack the absurd one-card starters of the higher tiers, and often can't use meta engines that well. More than one of these decks will have engines so large, they can't effectively use hand traps. Without further ado, let's get into the casual tier of the MonkeyFight TCG Complete Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier list. Nepthys barely scraped their way into Tier 4, for a reason you can already guess. They're level 2, so they can work with the Sprite engine as a band-aid to an otherwise terrible archetype. But seriously, this deck does have some plays. A ritual summon of this deck's level 2 ritual monster immediately summons into another level 2 Nepthys from the deck, so you don't lose too much value from the engine. What the deck does do competently is recoil resources and set up for some okay plays in future turns. You have a turn-delayed spell search, delayed destruction from the deck, and some graveyard recursion. The deck's Link monster is a great setup tool, but only for a turn 2 play, and the deck's big boss monster, Silurian Sacred Phoenix of Nepthys, does have passable board clear. But the downsides to this deck are very intense. You have to destroy a lot of cards in hand and field to proc Nepthys effects. While this does synergize with decks like Cosmos and Fire Kings, it more often than not just ends up dragging on resources. So much so that even a crazy engine like Sprite struggles not to neg under the engine. Batteryman is a very simple and questionable rank 4 Thunder engine. It's got fantastic synergy with archetypes like Thunder and with Thunder Dragon, which really is mostly why they're this high at all. In very specific circumstances, Batteryman can chain together summons and can pull cards out of the deck. The downside is, the deck's best effects are locked onto level 5 or higher monsters, and the deck's swarming is mid at best. The deck does have excellent recursion thanks to both generic support and its own lineup of back row, but still don't expect too much from the stated mess of a deck. Performage are the once tier 0 Pendulum Graveyard engine. We can roughly split this deck into 2 parts, good generic rank 4 enablers, and the half-banned Pendulum Extra Deck Turbo. Performage Plush Fire is banned, and a lot of the cards it synergizes with are also banned. More than that, the old Master Rule 3 mechanics the cards were designed around don't exist anymore, so this deck really has to rely more on the Graveyard engine side. Unfortunately, with the Ishizu cards limited, Gem Knight Seraphonite banned, Lightsworns being weak, and with that Grass Looks Greener being banned, this engine doesn't really have a home. It's unfortunate because Trick Clown, Hat Tricker, and Damage Juggler are all great board swarmers that just aren't enough to carry a deck into the modern format. It is ultimately still a perfectly fine casual deck at least, just don't expect to take it into any modern events. Here's a fun list using the fact that Performages are spellcaster monsters to combine the deck with Magistus for some decent plays. This small engine is more or less what the deck's restricted to nowadays. Timelords are a fan favorite stun deck for boomers who are mad at the game. While better than Final Countdown and Chainburn, this deck struggles due to its inherently bad basic gameplay loop. Time Lords summon themselves for free, are invulnerable to card destruction in battle, then after they battle, have a crazy strong effect that dramatically pushes forward the game. Effects such as having the opponent's life points, shuffling the opponent's board into their deck, and doing other forms of burn damage. Now, this deck wouldn't be so terrible if not for the non-destruction removal that's so common in this game. Kaijus, SP Little Knight, or really any negate can out a Timelord. This forces the deck into a weird sack-based position in the game, and it's why the deck is popular in a best-of-1 format like Master Duel. Classically, Timelords get paired with either Chainborn cards or just generic stun options, but Timelords have more been recently paired with the new line of Zark support for more funny options. Demise is a ritual deck that is all about spamming board wipes. There are two halves to this archetype's ritual monsters, the King and Queen. The King focuses on board wipes, and the Queen focuses on OTKs. Now, the most notable part of this archetype is that Demise King of Armageddon's board wipe effect is not once per turn. This is really solid, but there's not built-in disruptions to the deck, leaving a massive hole in the strategy. The deck is also unfortunately reliant on generic ritual engines such as Incantation, Maju of the Thousand Hands, and Diviner of Herald. These are fundamentally fine, but comes with the problem of both not inherently synergizing with Armageddon's ritual monster as tribute gimmick, and still having to fit hand traps in the deck. The deck does have built-in support to ritual summon from the deck, but like every ritual deck, it ends up not being enough to cope for the massive negs you have to do to ritual summon. Here's my deck list. I combine the deck with Kaijus for rank 10 plays, as well as for better removal. The deck is focused on going second to take advantage of the amazing board wipes offered by King of Armageddon. The Legendary Fisherman is yet another offshoot of the oversized Umi archetype. What it offers is a very funny Towers monster in the form of the Legendary Mark III. It has decent removal, is unaffected by spell and traps, and cannot be destroyed by card effect. This alone doesn't provide enough of a win con since it's so easy to remove. SP Little Knight. Put the generic removal on a link too. Good job, Konami. The Umi lineup of support provides additional protections, specifically targeting, as well as some more disruptions. Bahamut Shark, Stealth Kragan, and Abyss Dweller are all go-to plays. The deck also has synergy with the Water Barrier statue. Overall, it's solid enough to be casual, but it will definitely be eaten alive by any modern meta deck. Jinzo is an anti-trap deck that does just obliterate some matchups. If your opponent is playing a trap-heavy deck, negating all the trap options will be absolutely devastating. Jinzo as a deck has several ways to search Jinzo, and with modern Yu-Gi-Oh, it's very easy to establish a tribute for him, making the engines not a neg. One of the biggest plays modern Jinzo can do is use the Bystole Rebellion to set a face-up trap from the deck. This lets the deck special summon Jinzo the Machine Menace for free, and actually get plays going. In more goofy support, Cosmos Channeling enables funny hand control shenanigans, and Psychic Megacyber has funny equip removal. The problem with all of this is that an opponent is not likely playing a trap deck. You might get lucky with the sparse Labyrinth or Trap Tricks matchup, but it's not a dependable strategy to build your entire deck around countering one specific strategy. It's the same problem with other decks like Buster Blader. Gadgets are a dated core for a machine deck. Although thanks to Silver Gadget, Gold Gadget, and Platinum Gadget, this deck has new life as a rank 4 machine engine. Red, Green, and Yellow Gadget have a simple effect of searching another gadget when they're summoned. Basically, gadgets give you an incredibly long line of hand fodder for other engines. Surprisingly, the deck has aged well into working with train support, as well as with extra normal summon engines like Symphonics. The deck also pairs with ABC lists that are a bit dated. This would be all there is to gadgets, but Konami and their infinite wisdom decided to release yet another bad top end for the engine. Boot Up is a line of 5 cards, only 3 of which are playable. These cards focus on using gadgets as equips. It's not terrible on paper, but none of the cards synergize well with each other or search in the way you'd want. However, Boot Up Corporal, Command Dynamo, is a solid extender, but it's just not enough with how small this wave of support is. It honestly doesn't factor into this deck's ranking at all, it was just fun to mention. Cipher are a really good set of OTK-oriented Galaxy Extra Deck monsters that all mostly overlay on top of each other. Unfortunately, this amazing extra deck also comes with a set of mediocre main deck monsters to try to make them. The problems of this main deck is that it has to jump through more hoops than is needed to make the monsters level 8, and it just has problems putting monsters onto the field. Well, at least the engine can search a rank up spell. The extra deck carries a lot of weight, as does how much of this deck is tied to Galaxy support, but it doesn't make this deck anything more than a significantly suboptimal way to make a Galaxy deck. Just tech in 1 or 2 of the Cipher extra deck monsters into a Galaxy deck, and it'll do the same thing, but infinitely better. I think this deck does have a home with the new Horus line of monsters. Really, any rank 8 engine would help repair this deck. It's not super great, and I'm mixed on how to tier this, but I will mention it. Here we have another weird deck that isn't usually played as a deck, but does technically qualify for the tier list anyway. As an engine, World Legacy have several functions. First, they can be used with gears through the Orcust Mech Knight to set up for some solid link climbing, as well as the ability to pull out any World Legacy generic card that the deck wants, thanks to Lib, the World Key Blade Master. The engine also has unique synergies with Crawlers, Mech Knights, World Chalice, and Orcust. However, none of these decks and their builds on their own tend to run enough World Legacy cards to qualify them as a World Legacy deck for the tier list. On its own, World Legacy use big high-level monsters to do anything from make tokens to search World Legacy cards. The deck does depend on a lot of outside sources to get started, but honestly, it's not a terrible deck. Generic link spam works, at least enough to get it casually ranked anyway. The deck has random level 9 synergies that are very hard for the deck to use. But if you're going to try to make this deck work anyway, I recommend building the deck with a World Chalice engine as a starter. Overall, World Legacy is just very unexplored as its own deck. Lord of the Red is a ritual offshoot of Red Eye's Black Dragon. It still has all the same problems of Red Eyes, but it has a much more solid boss monster. Lord of the Red is all about getting a pop whenever a card effect is activated, and it can do this twice per turn. It can abuse the generic Red Eye support and the generic ritual support to play very consistently. The deck has access to the generic slate of ritual support, from Diviner of Hailed to Incantations to even Dogmatica. It's just still unfortunate that this is still a ritual deck. The deck can also sometimes make Red Eyes Dark Dragoons. I do have this listed low on my tier list in like a more pure Red Eyes list. It is hard to choose which one is better. I go back and forth on it. I think pure Red Eyes is a bit higher, solely because I think it synergizes better with Bystrals. It's all over the place. Pure Red Eyes is also more flexible, but Lord of the Red is just so much stronger in an in goal. You're not flailing about for a few turns like you do with Red Eyes, but in any case, it is a low casual deck. Goyo Guardian are a series of gimmick monsters loosely held together by similar typing and goals. There are two main parts to this engine. Goyo Defender, who summons 2 more copies of himself from the extra deck when he's synchro summoned. And then Goyo Emperor and Goyo Guardian, which steal an opponent's monster in some way. Goyo Emperor specifically does this as a disruption. This, of course, is a solid in goal, but the whole deck is extra deck only, making it reliant on outside engines for playability. As a deck, we're generally going to be doing this with righty and lefty driver for access to a level 3 synchro, but you also have access to Goyo Defender with Deep Sea Diva, Stardust Synchron, and really any old method for making a level 3 synchro. This whole combo opens up some solid rank 3 plays, as well as some decent link shenanigans. The issue lies in getting to this deck's boss monster, which practically requires the use of Miracle Synchro Fusion. Overall, Goyo is a solid casual deck that just isn't fully fleshed out enough to get higher on the list. Knowing Konami, we'll probably keep getting random one-off support monsters until the end of time. Tindangle are another failed experiment in the long line of bad modern flip decks. The deck has flip effects with solid searching, as well as solid swarming. What really drives this deck is its crazy link monster that sets up for OTKs with extreme ease. Thanks to the trap Tindangle Delaney, this deck can farm the board from nothing, giving access to a crazy grind game. Tindangles do have additional lines of extenders thanks to Crawlers, and to a lesser extent some Penguins. Crawler Soma lets the deck make a free Utopic F-Zero by summoning 2 Crawler monsters from the deck, and then going into the Ghost Trick line for 2 XYZs. The Penguin line sets up for Penguin Brave with Penguin Squire. You do have a ton of good options, but none of these really make up for the inherent problems you have to deal with when you're playing a flip summoning deck. All of this is only a band-aid to the speed cap that is flip summoning. Unlike every other deck, flip summoning has to use a turn or another effect to do anything, and that's just not viable in the current metagame. This deck is also extremely vulnerable to disruptions, locking you out of extenders if an opponent isn't stupid. Overall, Tindangles are a fun deck, held back by terrible game design. Which, story of Konami. Fortune Lady, not to be confused with Fortune Fairies, are a spellcaster level manipulation deck with a ton of support centered around drawing cards. Fortune Lady Water and Fortune Future are conditional draw 2s. Fortune Lady Light and Fortune Lady Calling provide this deck's field swarming. As a whole, Fortune Ladies are vulnerable to draw and Lockbird, any 2 negates, and really just any deck with enough oomph. To compensate for this, Fortune Ladies use several engines to try to turbo through cards. Illusion of Chaos and Magician Souls for draw power and field setup. Shadow's Light for combos in the Fortune Lady Light, and the Dogmatica engine for a better inboard with spellcaster synergy. Sometimes they can also rely on spellbooks for extra draws. Instead of showing you a good TCG list, here's a Master Duel Exodia Turbo list. It's all about abusing the engine to cheese out draws. This list has major issues with functioning in the modern game, but it really does highlight how crazy powerful the draw is. Heroic Challenger are level 4 and level 1 Warrior XYZ spam deck. Most of this deck is very straightforward, however the newest wave of support has the really funny gimmick of getting extra effects when you have 500 or less life points. A lot of this deck's extra deck is OTK focused, leaving a lot to be desired in the current format. However, the best card, Heroic Champion Gandiva, can destroy 2 of an opponent's monsters when they're special summoned. Heroic Champion John Greffer is really good at setting up for Utopic Future. And while it's not super relevant, Heroic Champion Kusanagi can negate a trap card once per turn. It does take 3 materials, but theoretically it could come up. Just another niche thing you have to consider when tier listing every deck. Unfortunately for the deck, that's about it. It's another okay rank 4 OTK spam deck, and unlike some of the other ones, well, I say that, but literally every rank 4 deck is just kind of the same. There's so many rank 4 spam decks. Why, Konami? You couldn't give them something interesting to do? I mean, the 500 life point gimmick is cool, but it's only the new support that gets the effect gimmicks. So the older support just feels like it's in this weird limbo where nothing really works out the way you want it to. It's just mid. Well, that's why I put it in casual. Despite being known in the modern game for the Gimmick Puppet lock, Gimmick Puppets are a rank 8 spam deck. Holding this deck together is a combination of mediocre graveyard effects, go second special summon conditions, and a series of bad rank 8 monsters. Luckily, this deck has the amazing Link monster Gimmick Puppet Chimera Doll, which is a full setup for the deck. With this, we can ignore a lot of the deck's old support and only be locked into the machine type extra deck monsters as a cost, and that leaves us open to a wide variety of techs. The newest and best example is how it works with the Horus Engine, a series of level 8 monsters with graveyard synergy. It of course cycles through our deck and puts Gimmick Puppet Jury Doll into the graveyard. Honestly, it's very solid, but it doesn't fix how weak Gimmick Puppet's inboards are. You're mostly still focusing on doing weird burn effects and OTKs. Meklord are one of the only machine decks that don't really have much synergy with rank 10 trains or earth machines. That's because they started their life out as an anti-synchro anime deck, making half of the effects useless in a majority of duels. Modern support really only added some minor board spamming, leaving the deck in the bad space it started, mostly trying to OTK with their new Meklord Astro Dragon Triskelion. Most combo lines follow either Meklord Infinity Core for a search of Meklord Assembly, which gets a destruction and a monster search, or a combo line can maybe follow up from Emperor Grano for a risky tribute into 2 monsters. Either way, it's really not going to be a lot. At least the deck can make a spell negate with Meklord Emperor Rysel. It's not good, but it is something consistent. Elementsabers are an experimental deck focusing around synergizing with the elemental lords. Uniquely, the deck's monsters have the ability to change attributes in the graveyard. However, the other monster effects all have the cost of sending Elementsabers from hand to graveyard, locking out what otherwise would be good disruptions. The deck's field spell is designed to counteract this by replacing the from hand cost with a from deck cost, ultimately making Elementsabers a field spell deck. The elemental lords themselves have solid effects: hand looping, solid board wipes, and graveyard steals. However, controlling exactly 5 monsters in the graveyard is somehow a bit too slow for the deck. Newer builds tend to abuse the graveyard change attributes for other strong synergies. Bystools and Chaos are one such outlet for this, having absurdly easy summoning requirements and the ability to recur light and dark monsters from graveyard. Another synergy outlet is Invoked, as Invoked require different attributes for their fusion summons. This is all well and good, but at the end of the day, Elementsabers are just too inconsistent. You have to see the field spell. It will single-handedly make plays, but without it, every other Elementsaber card is kind of a brick. Ancient Fairy Dragon can help some builds, but an actual in-archetype searcher should have released with the deck. Here we have another odd deck split: Archfiends, Red Dragon Archfiends, and Summon Skull Archfiends. Summon Skull Archfiends are on their own lower tier in tier 3, while Red Dragon Archfiends, kind of mixed with Resonators, will be together in a higher tier later. This placement deals with the classic generic Archfiends. Still, Archfiends have an absurd range of 60 plus monsters. One wave of support is dice-based, another wave of support is good and graveyard-based, and there's still a whole mess of Archfiends that fall into random decks like Labyrinth, Infernity, and Red Eye's Black Dragon. Let's start by explaining a few key cards. Archfiend Eris is a search for an Archfiend card when it's sent to the graveyard. Archfiend Emperor is targeted removal. Archfiend Paleozoic is a field spell that summons an Archfiend from the deck. These little simple loops provide a really good core to the deck. Outside of that, what you're going to do specifically varies. It could be DDD High Wave King Caesar Turbo, like in a Chess Archfiends. It could be a generic Labyrinth plays, like in Labyrinth Archfiend, or it could be Red Dragon plays, like in Resonator Archfiends. Now, instead of a deck list for this one, I'm linking to the YouTube channel, The Archfiend Guy. It's got great profiles for this underrated deck, even if most of them are a bit old at this point. Also, I've linked his Archfield Primer Guide It is 73 pages of a great guide that is always treated as an Archfiend document. Yeah, I do read guides like this when I can. It is one of the reasons why these videos take so long to make. Contrary to popular belief, Golden Castle is not just a tech engine used in Grand Maju decks. It is its own full archetype with its own mediocre goals and dreams. Hextrude is a solid beatstick, Iron Hands and Princessin are very interesting board swarming, and Golden Castle of Stroidenberg is battle protection. There's a lot of free trash, and it's all very cool. But yeah, the engine is really only usable in Grand Maju, because Golden Castle banishes 10 of your cards face down on the standby phase. It is popular, but it's not better than casual. The only other interesting thing I've seen with this deck is you can combine it with Nimlaria. It creates a gigantic Dreaming Nimlaria effect. You would need a bit of luck to make this work in practice. Near the very top of the copium spectrum, there are a few classic decks. Dark Magician, Grand Maju, Burning Abyss, but one of the saddest ones I've ever seen is Amorpahge. On paper, Amorpahge should be one of the most powerful stun decks ever printed. Amorphage Goliath, banishing all cards sent to the graveyard. Amorphage Lechery, turning off spell cards. Amorphage Sloth, turning off searching, and almost all of them preventing summons from the extra deck. All of these powerful effects are killed by two incredibly simple yet devastating requirements. You must control an Amorphage monster, and on your standby phase, you must tribute a monster or destroy the Amorphage card in scale. To deal with these massive requirements, one of two things will either happen. Either this deck is teched into a better deck as a 1 or 2 card engine, or an outside engine will cope enough disruption to feint an Amorphage engine. Lifesteals and Branded seem to be the most popular modern variant. You know, dragon synergy and whatnot. However, I believe there is a path to building this deck with modern Pendulum support. It's not an easy solve, but trust me, it is there. As the strategy is right now though, there's not enough consistency to push the deck higher. Amorphage tend to rely on 3 to 4 card combos, and that's really rough, especially when it ends up with most builds lacking the room for hand traps and staples. If the strategy was less toxic, I'd say it should get another wave of support, but honestly, it's probably for the best that this deck is only casual. Graydle are a weird relic of a much more civilized age, when the battle phase could almost be depended on. When Graydles get destroyed by battle or a specific card type of effect, monster, spell, or trap, they steal an opponent's monster. This should enable a bunch of really good combos that you could do by triggering off their own destruction. However, only one of the monsters works off spell destruction, one of them works off trap destruction, and one of them works off monster destruction. So it's not as consistent as you'd want it to be. Second, an opponent must control a monster. So, of course, this means your combos will have to wait until turn 3, or you'll have to go second. Also in the negative camp is the ease of non-destruction removal. SP Little Knight does exist, and even more generic than that, Nightmare Unicorn. Graydles become practically impossible without forcing their effects with blowouts and kaijus. Speaking of which, Graydle Kaiju remains as the most popular way to play Graydles, giving both a target to swing into and a reward to plus off of. I haven't seen a lot of love for this deck, which is a shame because the potential is definitely here. I'm 90% sure that there's some solid engine that could crack this deck wide open and maybe land it a tier higher. I'm just definitely not the one to find it. Legendary Synchro Storm is a set remembered for the release of Baron de Fleur and the meta wave of Lyrilusk. However, releasing alongside Baron was an entire wave of support for the D-Fleur archetype. D-Fleur and Necrofleur are a small synchro engine and a collection of miscellaneous anime cards that really only serve to make Baron de Fleur. Now, in a just world, Baron de Fleur would be locked into needing a Fleur tuner. However, it's generic, making this entire engine kind of redundant. What we do have, though, is kind of all over the place with what you can run it with. You can do generic synchro tools, generic machine stuff, or you could be insane and run it with Noble Knights. Since this deck randomly has cards with Noble Knights and Noble Arms in the name. There is a scuffed combo to use Horse of the Floral Knights and Centaur Mina to spam out a Gwynethar, Queen of the Noble Arms, to the field for an easy level 8 synchro. Honestly though, this deck is just too vulnerable to disruption to get it any higher. Here we have Crystron, a deck designed around synchro summoning on the opponent's turn. This archetype is most famous for its absurd generic legacy support card, Crystron Halki Fibrax. It was Konami's way of creating old support that could still sell to a wider audience than just the 2 remaining fans of this otherwise forgettable deck. What Crystron do today can best be described as making Trishula and Baron de Fleur on your turn, and then making some unholy combination of random machine synchros on the opponent's turn. I've seen F.A. Dawn Dragster, TG Blaster Blade, and Vermilion Dragon all thrown out as in boards. It's suboptimal to say the least. There are benefits to this deck. The non-Crystron tuners are all extremely recursive, letting the deck pull out resources once they're in the grave. The tuner monsters are all free summons, even if they're locked into machines. Synergy-wise, this deck can take advantage of a lot of outside engines. Dangers can spam the board and flood the graveyard, Scraps can abuse Scrap Recycler for crazy combos, and Karakuri can extend using actual synchro monsters for hard-to-make boards. Unfortunately, in most games the deck can ultimately fold pretty easily, due to not having the greatest of starters. This deck wasn't designed with modern Yu-Gi-Oh in mind, so it doesn't exactly handle disruption very well. Also, being locked in the machine monsters really limits the creativity you can show on your opponent's turn. Like, imagine if this was a Tearlament style deck where you had the full force of synchros on your side. Sylvans are a deck entirely designed around abusing the card's soul chart. By dumping big plants into the graveyard, this deck could set up for massive rank 8 and rank 7 plays. Unfortunately, it has been almost 5 years since Soul Charge was banned, leaving this deck behind in a mess of inconsistent and vulnerable plays. Sylvans have had the unfortunate gimmick of needing to excavate plant monsters from the top of the deck. If they hit a plant, it's usually followed by a massive payoff. If not, the effect is dead and a combo will end. This turns Sylvan deck building into a lose-lose of trying to put in enough plant monsters to have consistent excavates, and still have enough actually good spells and engines to keep up with the modern game. Luckily, this deck can rely on the absurdity of modern plant engines for free setup. Sanavalon has easy synergy with the deck, and can net a free search, a free special summon, and a free link 4. Therons also provide a free Omni-Negate just for existing. Rose support helps with unique synchro plays, and Rika can provide an extra layer of starters and disruptions. This all begs the question though, what does Sylvan actually add to a Plant Ball deck? It's got some inconsistent plant level 1 searching, inconsistent Lone Flower Blossom recursion, and inconsistent extra draws. You just kinda end up playing a worse version of Rika Sun Avalon. Sylvans really do just need their own main deck starters and extenders to justify their use, but for some reason, Konami never gave them one. Ojama's asked the question, how much free trash does it take to create a competent deck? Well, after 10 plus years of chazzing it up, it's obvious that the answer is clearly not enough. Ojamas have had a variety of bad gimmicks. They can flood the field with level 2 Ojama monsters, they can swap their attack and defense, they can lock an opponent's zone, and lastly, they have random direct synergy with archetypes like ABC, XYZ, Armed Dragon, and non-direct synergy with way more. Building Ojamas with sprites is viable for a level 2 spam deck. Building them with Tri-Brigade works because they're already beast type, and you used to be able to build them with Paleo Frogs by abusing the trap cards when sent to grave effect. Overall, these builds would inevitably run into the same problems. First, you're running a ton of normal monsters, so it's a brick city. Second, there are so many much better ways to spam the board. And 3, a majority of the Ojama spam options are just outdated, such as Ojama Blue, who acquires the destruction by battle for the search. Honestly, if you're trying to play Ojamas, I recommend committing to the bit. Here's a Master Duel list that uses Ojama Simulation to make ABC Buster Dragon. This list is kind of the most solid you can really go for. It should be noted that Ojama do have some of the best access to A to C Dragon in the entire game, and I really recommend trying for that if you're going to do anything with this deck. Bujins are a dated graveyard stun deck. The deck works by sending Beast Bujins to the graveyard to trigger protection effects for the Bujin monsters on the field. The main deck monsters are incredibly mid, or just completely outdated. Luckily, this deck's XYZ monsters are actually cracked. From Susanoo, who is just a search or dump and an OTK, to Kagasuchi, who is a mill 5, you've got some crazy good options. Just good luck playing through hand traps when Bujin Torafune is crazy hand trap fodder. Modern Bujin builds do have some solid options thanks to cards like Tri-Brigade Revolt and generic floodgates like there can only be one and goes in match. Just be ready, Bujins are gonna be slow no matter what you do. In my unhinged opinion, I think there is a Bujin build we can do with Horus and Tearlaments. I don't think it's gonna break the game, but being able to set up the grave more efficiently might be able to give Bujins the extra kick they need. And to end my review of Bujins, Yamato has aged terribly. Starry Knight are a forgettable archetype with the unique gimmick of using level 4 fairy monsters to tag into a big level 7 light dragon monster. The deck has the bare minimum of searching, the bare minimum of recursion, and the bare minimum of disruption. That's why the deck is so non-existent in the average player's mind. Some cards also have this weird bonus if your opponent controls a dark monster. Once again, like other archetypes like Jinzo and Meklords, this is just too inconsistent to be competitive. Also, Starry Knight's main disruptions come in the form of quick effect summoning the level 7 Starry Knight Dragon, which make deck lists very odd and clunky. Tech-wise, Starry Knights do have several unique options. Kashtira Birth enables easy normal summons of Starry Dragons, and Kashtiras as a whole are just a solid engine. Most popular tech-wise would be Bystils, as the deck is dragon-oriented and entirely light. Outside of that, it's anyone's guess as to whether to use janky fairy support or random dragon support. Honestly, fairy and dragon just don't have much overlap. If you don't like that, you could also just play this deck as a stun build, but you'd be taking away any of the already minimal uniqueness the deck has. Chronomaly are a Zexal XYZ Turbo deck based off of archaeological old stuff. It's based off old stuff. The biggest things holding this deck together is an actually amazing rank 5 monster negate and the fact that most of the deck's key monsters are rock type. This means generic support like Gallant Granite, Quacky Meru, and of course the crazy powerful Elementsaber engine can be used with the deck. The deck has easy access to Naturia Beast and any rank 4s imaginable. Generic, I know, but good nonetheless. On their own, Adamantipator's have cards like Crystal Bones for easy swarming, Never Disc for easy searching, and most significantly, Esperanza Glyph for a free summon of a rank 5 XYZ monster for doing nothing but controlling a rank 4. This is a trap, so it plays around cards like Dark Ruler no more. The deck also has consistent access to machine rank 5s, meaning Cyber Dragon Infinity and other generic rank 5 options. Outside of that, most of the legacy XYZ monsters are dedicated to OTKs and Jank Burn. This here is my build of Chronomaly Adamantipator. I really do recommend you give it a try. Paleozoic are a monster trap deck that never really aged beyond 2016. They have solid enough disruptions, such as being able to throw out a Book of Moon, a Banish, and a back row removal. However, needing to spend a turn setting up traps, and combined with the inherent vulnerability of back row decks, this archetype has not really aged well. For the positives, this deck's extra deck monsters provide immense consistency and much needed disruptions. The deck's monsters as a whole are entirely unaffected by monster effects, making them uniquely resilient. Being level 2 in water type opens the door for some crazy synergies. Ojamas, Nimbles, Sprites, and Frogs have all been used at various points in this deck's history. However, I feel modern formats just aren't the place for this deck. Can't go second. Evenly matched, Lightning Storm, Cosmic Cyclone, and Harpy's Feather Duster hurt. You'll end up having to almost entirely rely on an outside deck like Sprite to do the heavy lifting needed to let you set up. It's not like Labyrinth or Trap Tricks, where you have cards to set on your opponent's turn or activate a trap card immediately. Ritual Beast are one of the only decks to get a card banned, not because of the power level, but because of how insanely long their combos would be. Since Ritual Beast are a contact fusion deck with fusion monsters that tag back out into other materials, the deck would go through long loops, abusing Alti-Conahawk to search 3 or 4 cards, particularly Ritual Beast Steeds for a ton of disruptions. Today, the deck is inconsistent, incredibly vulnerable to hand traps, especially Nibiru, and just kind of lacking in general. However, there are a ton of new techs, keeping the deck alive until its next wave of support in the new Dual Terminal pack, with which the new support can confidently move this deck up in future to the middle of Tier 5. For now though, the deck uses cards like Wind the Wind Charmer for consistency, the Wind Dragon Ruler Tempest for combo plays, and Brain Research Lab as an extender. What's really keeping this deck together is being able to play around banish cards like Dimension Shifter, Dimensional Barrier, and Macro Cosmos. These generic cards are just too game warping not to be accounted for, even if they don't really push the deck out of casual. Holding back the deck is really just how hand trappable it is, and how few starters the deck has. You can't really wait a turn to set up a Laura or a Win, so you need Elder or another extender like Emergency Teleport. Star Seraph are an incredibly straightforward XYZ engine. They only have one unique gimmick, and that's having its best cards locked into the XYZ summon of a monster that needs 3 materials. What keeps this deck above the rest is that its materials not only summon themselves for cheap, they also provide extra draws. Chair is an easy draw 1, and Stick is also removal. For rank 4 options, you have Evil Swarm Ouroboros, Prime Math Mech Laplation, and if you're doing a rank up build, number 104 Masquerade for the memes. Star Seraph are so generic, you can really run them with almost anything, but the most popular is of course the Utopic and rank up packages. Really, Star Seraph are just the definition of a casual deck, and there's just not much else to say about the 100th XYZ Rank 4 Turbo deck. By the way, there are 15.5 decks on this tier list that exist exclusively for making generic Rank 4 monsters. I will let you figure out what the 0.5 is. Relinquished, also known as Restrict or Thousand Eyes, are a janky set of anime support based around equipping your opponent's monsters to Relinquished. Traditionally, these monsters have been very hard to access, but with the newer boss monsters, they are significantly more generic, letting them even be a tech in some cases, like Relinquished Anima, or with Restrict and Instant Fusion. These are popular generic techs because of how good equipping an opponent's monster is as removal. It dodges an absurd amount of protections. The decks in archetype support consist of a great equip removal hand trap, a graveyard recursion piece, more equip removal, and a fusion spell that is also more equip removal. That's really all the deck does. Unfortunately, being really good at this type of removal doesn't get the deck beyond casual. Having no starters and only removal is just not a good recipe for a deck. Luckily, this deck can take advantage of the generic branded fusion engine. By using Hex-Sealed Fusion, we can actually go into the Restrict extra deck, no worries. It's a whole 9 additional starters that don't conflict with the deck. People will look at you funny for making Millennium Eyes Restrict off a branded fusion, but we didn't pick up Restrict as a deck to care about what other people think, did we? Spirits are a classic deck based around the type of monsters, with the unfortunate gimmick of returning to hand the turn after you normal summon them. However, spirits have the benefit of years of cracked legacy support and changing game mechanics to compensate for this problem. Recently, the deck has received Ojama, who gives you access to the additional normal summon of a spirit monster from just being in hand. Combine this with Ojama, you get a rank 4 you made without special summoning its materials. This combo has been very useful in the Rogue to Meta relevant deck, Exo-Sister, and to a much lesser extent Mathmex. However, since it's only these 2 cards, these do not count for the purpose of spirits on this tier list. Spirits on their own have access to a variety of free special summons, a bad ritual and pendulum engine, and some really hard to use, but really funny, battle phase game winners. Specifically Yamato Dragon and Hino Kagasuchi, who draws you 5 cards and forces your opponent to discard their hand when you do battle damage with each of them respectively. These can take an opponent off guard, but yeah, they're kinda hard to use. The deck also has access to some funny classic techs, such as Yada Garasu for the outdated lockdowns, and a Mono Iwado for turning off an opponent's monster effects. These cards are good, but just not quite good enough to get it out of casual, especially with how much disruption is in the modern game. Side note from parts 1 and 2 of this series, Shadowbirds have been moved up to casual, alongside their newest wave of support, releasing in Age of Overlord. Alright, and that's about it for this part. I had to split up casual into 2 parts, so it could be more manageable to produce. If you want a taste of the effort that goes into producing these videos, check out my live streams, where I stream the writing process. The VODs for that are on my second channel, if you don't want to try to catch one live. If you want to see any deck list shown in this video, check out the links in either the description or a pinned comment. The players who made these decks put in a ton of hard work into them, and oftentimes have amazing guides and quality videos. They can go more in depth with each of these decks than I can. And if you like this tier list as a whole, please subscribe to see more. I've got other videos in the works, but also more tier list content as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.